Welcome to the media. I'm Michael Fields. We've previously mentioned the great men of the news business who appear on the screen back there behind me. They range from John Peter Zenger of America's Colonial Past to Ben Bradley, famed editor of the Washington Post. And if they were all alive, none of them are, they might give very different answers to the question, what is news? On this edition of The Media, we're going to explore that question with our panel, members all of App State's Department of Communication, Heather Page Preston next to me, and Dr. Frank Aycock down at the end of the desk. Let's see, David Spiceland still missing in action. Let's talk about definitions at the top for a minute. What is news?
Well, for me, growing up and working in the news media, it was reporting factual information. Today, the term that I hear all the time is storytelling. And those two, to me, are like water and oil. They just don't mix. But this is the way things have developed over time. For me, news is simply reporting the facts with no embellishments whatsoever. That's what the op-ed page is for.
Heather?
Probably in its most simplistic form, it's just a report on change. If something changes from what it has been, it's newsworthy, right? That doesn't mean that everything's newsworthy, obviously, and there are a number of things that keep things off the air or out of print because they're not considered newsworthy. But it is just very simply a report on change. I think that maybe Gay Talese would disagree with you in terms of the difference between, or the oil and water mix between factual information and storytelling information. I'm a big fan of literary journalism, so that's exactly what I thought of, really beautiful prose from that writer. But factual information tells a story as well. And it's to me, in its best form, it is a factual story with the most up-to-date information, delivered in a way that an audience can understand it and perhaps relate to it.
All right, now, let me put this to you both. Let's say that you lived in New York City, in a market where there are several daily newspapers. And they are sort of demographically positioned to serve different segments of the newspaper reading audience. You don't see this quite so much in a city the size of Charlotte, let's say, where there is one basic daily newspaper and it pretty much has to serve all. On any given day, the front page of the New York Times would be very, very different than the front several pages of one of the tabloids, the Daily News or the New York Post. Are both of those underlined newspapers by your by your definition?
Can I take it? Oh goodness.
Different stories, different treatment of those stories.
Different treatment of those stories. There are lots of subtleties with the news. One of those is something that's not so subtle in and of itself, and that's sensationalism. How are you delivering those facts? In what ways are you telling the story? Who are you quoting in the story? How credible are your sources? Did you make an effort to get multiple viewpoints? All of that plays into what is news and what people would consider high news versus low news.
Should the standards, David, be the same? How is the consumer of news to know if, as the editor of the Daily News, the New York Daily News, I apply different standards to what is news than the editor, my counterpart at the New York Times? Should there be a disclaimer on the bottom of the front page that says, these are our standards, this is how many people we went to source this story? How do we know that this is legitimately news in the one sense and maybe not in the other?
Well, I'm not familiar with the New York papers all that well, but I would say this much with regard to any type of sensationalized news reporting, whether it be that, whether it be the Inquirer, the Observer, Midnight, any of those along those lines, that It's probably the tradition, at least for the Daily News and for the Post. They have a history. You know, going back to 1896 with New York Times, you know, their idea of all the news that's fit to print, which some people say should be all the news that fits.
We print.
Yeah.
That's from Mad Magazine, by the way.
And but then, and they have the reputation all the way back to the yellow journalism period and all.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Post came about during the jazz journalism period of the 1920s, much more of a sensationalized news reporting that lasted up until World War II began, and continues on to today. When they're trying to find a different audience out there, they have to find a different style of reaching them. And I think their style reaches a certain type of audience, just like Fox News reaches one audience and MSNBC reaches the other. The newspapers do the same thing.
All right, so in other words, you bring up the cable news phenomenon. Fox was sort of defined for itself a kind of right of center perspective. After who knows how many format changes, MSNBC sort of found themselves playing adversary to Fox in a sort of left of center part of the spectrum, the political spectrum. CNN sort of stays in the dull central area. Now,
I would question that.
Why? Tell me.
Because
you think
I don't think it's possible any longer for a news organization to stay in the center, to be all the news that's fit to print of the 1890s and 1900s that the New York Times was. A study was done back during the 2012 election of the cable news channels, showed that none of the three were particularly central. Even CNN had a tendency to lean more toward the liberal side. MSNBC was like 100% liberal side. Fox was about 75% conservative. And when you talk about centrist, if you want to say 60% to 40% is centrist, well, that's about the best you can get today, I guess. But what worries me is that Jeff Zucker, who used to be at NBC, has taken over at CNN. And he's already said that he wants to have entertainment programming on CNN. You know, documentaries, docudramas, things along those lines. So maybe we ought to call it, instead of Cable News Network, we ought to call it CNEN, for Cable News and Entertainment Network, like we have ESPN.
I wonder, though, that when we all think of ourselves in a way in our department, because certainly not all of us in the communication department are journalists. We don't all cover news. We don't all teach how to cover the news, and so forth. That's really, well, yes, you sort of do, don't you?
I've worn that hat in the past. Yeah.
Okay.
I come from a journalism background.
So if you're standing in the front of a room full of students, and you say, this is the news. This is what you may want to do as a career. And if you lay down standards and say, this is what you're going to have to become to be a journalist, someone who gathers, presents the news, what do you tell them? How broadly is the definition that you paint of being a journalist, being a news gatherer, being a writer, being a presenter of the news?
I think in my case, I give them the ideal, which would be don't sensationalize. But we know that's going to happen. Don't speculate. We know that's going to happen, right? So it's the ideal versus the real life application of being a journalist. There are lots of constraints that go into making the news, whether it goes on air or it's in print or online. It's you've got the 24/7 news cycle. You've got budget cuts, which have removed the ability to staff bureaus or have bureaus at all. You've got joint operating agreements, like ABC shares footage with BBC. So there are lots of things that go into making the news that have an effect on carrying out the ideal. So I try to give them both ends of that spectrum and say at some point you're going to have to decide where you get a job, if that place upholds enough of your personal standards for news in terms of ethics, because obviously we've got a hefty dose of ethics in all of these discussions, and then they take a separate ethics class. You're going to have to find your balance in life, because it is a balance, and to me that would be the true aspect of news, is that you are looking for a balance, those multiple perspectives, different voices. You're not going to the same old sources. You're writing things, and in my case, you're writing things that are truthful and present as holistic a picture as possible.
I'm going to put you on the spot.
Go for it.
This is shameless. I'm a student.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Preston, how would you write the headline for your newspaper?
I don't write headlines. We have people to do that.
Yeah, okay, but how would you instruct me to write a headline, 9 churchgoers massacred in Charleston Black Church? How would you, what would what you're teaching me lead me toward in writing that headline?
Well, you want the heavy-duty practical one?
Mm-hmm.
If it's print or it's online, is it a single-deck headline, a double-deck headline?
Which
How many
means?
spaces do you have? Or do you have a 1 line or 2 lines in order to say what you need to say?
Mm-hmm.
It used to be in the old days, back in the 80s, when you had to lay out everything and measure the type and make it fit. The
Which,
width,
of course,
the width of type, so that you could choose your words.
How big and
yes,
what words?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. A capital W is much larger than a capital I, right? So you had to be able to be very clever in your writing skills in order to say something that was enticing enough, it is a very fine line you walk, enticing enough that is still truthful, that is enticing and yet not solely sensational, and fit. And you still have the fit issue, you just don't have all the space in the world to put things in print or even online.
Dave, Frank, I'm looking past you to where David should be. Tell me, if you were confronted with choosing the order of presentation, the rundown in a newscast, a television newscast or a radio newscast, what sorts of things run through your mind when you're sitting there in an editorial position and saying, we'll lead with this, we'll follow up with this, I'm going to move this down to inside the book or later in the newscast? What are the things that that guide you to make that decision?
Well, obviously, first thing is importance. You know,
To whom?
to your listeners or your viewers. I'm taking this from a local TV market rather than the network.
Philadelphia being a little different than Tri-Cities?
Well, certainly.
Okay.
Although you might find that in a third or fourth or fifth radio station doing news, or the third of 3 TV stations, or the third of 4, they might make it very simple. If it bleeds, it leads, which is the old traditional thing that if, you know, murders, rapes, robberies, car accidents, things along those lines. But if you really want to talk about what do we lead with and how we make that decision, I think that importance, locality,
Close to home.
close to home,
Consequence?
consequence possibly, but also always hard news rather than feature, something along those lines. And then secondarily, you look at conflict, where the conflict comes in, what type of conflict.
Between the people in the story.
People in the story, or people in nature, hurricane, something along those lines. And then I guess also, going back to what I said at first, what is most likely to catch your audience, because you still got to catch your audience. Okay.
And that's where the business aspect comes in. I mean, as one of, I'm not sure which one I remember, you will see it zipping by because you're facing the screen, but tell us when you see the quote from one of our 11 big names in media and journalism in particular. One of them says, make no mistake about it, news is a business. I think it was Henry Luce, as a matter of fact, who said it. It's been a while since I typed those things out. It is a business.
It is.
If you're publishing a newspaper, if you're the manager of or the owner of a radio station, if it's a television station's newscast, you have to be able to be the best at it, do it as well as you can, so that you attract the most amount of viewers. And doing it well doesn't necessarily mean doing it well. That's another of maybe so far we've talked about maybe a dozen lines you have to straddle. How do you know when you've crossed over that line?
When you get lots of letters to the editor, when your sponsors pull out. There are lots of ways you'll know.
Lawsuits.
Lawsuits, absolutely.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that you've been wrong or that you haven't done a good job or that you haven't done the right thing.
That's
It
true.
means that
That's
you've wounded somebody and that they think you're liable
That's
in
true.
some way.
Yes.
And that brings up another thing. We talk about investigative journalism. At least I think we do. Is there more of that now or less of it? We're a very litigious society. And the more you go into the investigative side of journalism, the more likely you are to get yourself in trouble, expensive trouble. More, less, safer, more dangerous today.
I think there is less, but I think it has more to do with budget cuts. It's expensive.
And time consuming.
Yes, to allow one of your best reporters, because you do want, the best people who are inquisitive and have enough contacts and have enough know-how to navigate life, to take one of your best reporters and allow her or him out into the field for all the time it takes to engage in investigative journalism. It's very costly to do that because you're taking them off of covering other things that need to be covered.
And yet, if you look at the evening network newscasts, if you watch CNN, not as much MSNBC, not as much Fox, there is always at least one or two investigative pieces or series ongoing. Most newspapers have, even if they're sort of half-hearted attempts or once-over-lightly attempts, they seem to have something going on all the time. Do people really follow those? Are we really, we don't vote, we don't take an active role, most of us, in citizenship. Why then would investigative reporting, is it the Mike Wallace 60 Minutes thing? Where you get the goods on somebody.
Well,
Is it entertaining?
From a consumer perspective, yes. It's easy to sit at home on your couch and watch somebody do all of the work for you. Yeah. That's why I would watch it. One of the reasons.
I think that we see really less of the investigative type of reports because we got these magazine shows. You got 60 Minutes, you've got 2020, you've got Dateline NBC. Every one of our networks is doing a type of program that would be considered mini docs or something along those type of things. Interestingly enough, the 2020 is produced out of the news department, whereas
60 Minutes.
60 Minutes is produced out of the news
2020
department.
is the
20 out of the
entertainment
department,
Of
which
ABC.
kind of makes a kind of an interesting dichotomy there between the two of them. I would go one step further with regard to the business aspect of it. For me, I think one of the reasons we don't see this sort of thing is because now the news has to make a profit, at least in television news, and at least in network news. And I believe that it's because of the fact that every one of those three networks that we think of is actually owned by a company that has no involvement in news. Okay, you've got Comcast owning NBC.
Cable company.
A cable company, the largest. Before that, it was General Electric that owned it. ABC is owned by Disney.
Walt Disney, yeah.
You know, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck.
CBS was spun off of Viacom.
It's about to be picked back up by Viacom, which is a production house. Okay, all three of those are not like the days of William Paley, not like the days of Edward R. Murrah, who's been up there on that screen, where they said, we'll take the loss in the news department and we'll make it up on the entertainment side. They say now it's got to be profitable as well. So if you're going to make it profitable, you've got to start beginning to bend those objectivity, back off and let's make sure the news is correct, because all of a sudden you've got to make a profit, which means you've got to bring eyeballs in, which means you've got to get ratings. You know, and now you're fighting cable news networks, you're fighting Jon Stewart, Daily Show when he was doing it.
Shocking how many people use that as their main source of news.
Bill Maher on HBO. You've got Stephen Colbert before he left. And then you've got Rush and Sean and Ed and Herman and all of those wonderful radio people who will tell you that they're entertainers, but most
to get
people
themselves off the hook.
to get themselves off the hook. But most people will sit there and will believe them in terms of gospel. Okay, if you're a network, especially, what are you going to do if you got 30 minutes?
Minus 16 minutes of commercials and
Exactly.
promos and things. All right, Dr. Aycock, I'm in your class, raising my hand again. I want to ask you about a story that I might cover that would give me a chance to really make a splash, give our station or our newspaper an opportunity to make a splash. But I don't really have a whole lot of thoroughly sourced facts. Okay? Let's say, for instance, in the very early stages of the Charleston shooting, when you have the obligation to say this horrendous thing happened in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, but we don't know a lot about it yet. How do I mitigate that dilemma? Be first, be fast, but I don't have a lot of really hard facts. What do you tell me as your student?
I say report what you know for certain now, because we can build on that story as we go along, especially in electronic media. We can continue to build on that story throughout the day. So if all you know is that 9 people have been killed, you report that 9 people have been killed in Charleston at this black church. Then when you find out that the person who did it was white, then you add that into your story. But you don't go out and you don't speculate as, oh, well, is this or is this not a hate killing? Is this or is this not the, I don't know, Ku Klux Klan or whatever the case may be.
Or a Muslim terrorist or something.
Certainly. And, you know, you tell them what you know, and that's it. And then you build your story with subsequent, not newspapers would be editions, but subsequent broadcasts.
So in other words, you're saying to me, I'm your student, you can really have it both ways. You can get this on the air quickly, but you must withhold anything that we don't know is a certainty.
Absolutely, because as long as you're reporting the facts, not truth necessarily, but the facts, you're going to be protected against any sort of legality or anything else. And this is an important story. You know, we have a student go berserk here and blast their way through 3 dorm floors or something like that. That's a story. We want that on the air right now because people need to know that. People may need to know that because they may be going to the next dorm.
Exactly.
But you say, you know, there is a shooter, or there is, you know, people. There have been shots fired in a dorm, and then you build on the story from there. What you don't do is simply say, okay, we've heard that there's an active shooter, and we're going to put it on the air, and it turns out that here on campus, it was never the case.
Which of course
happened.
Yeah.
Now, we have about a minute and a half left. Real quick answers in a sentence or two. Why does the public hate the media so much?
You go first.
Oh, because she has a good one to come. Why do they hate us so much? Not, well, I mean, we're training media people, pretty much.
We are.
I don't think that people hate the media. I think people hate an institution called the media. I think people like NBC because they watch it every night. They like ABC because they watch it every night. They watch CBS every night. They watch CNN every night. So they like that. But when you talk about the media as an institution, it's like saying the difference between a French person saying, I hate Americans, but I like you, and you're an American. You know, there's the institution, and then there's what's factual.
I like my congressman, but I hate Congress.
Exactly.
Heather,
To
we have
bring-
about 30 seconds.
To bring it full circle then, it's a, you know, the media produces news. News is a report on change. Change makes us uncomfortable. If, you know, we don't see headlines that say the sun's coming up today because we take that for granted. But that's a powerful affirmation as opposed to the if it bleeds, it leads. We just don't like change.
Well, and that's it. This is an issue. What is news that we could hammer around for weeks, months? Take it for now. 26 minutes and 30 seconds. That's all we got for this time. That's our program. We hope you'll join us next week on App TV's The Media. I'm Michael Fields.